Today, a headache or a sudden fever can be solved with a simple pill. You just grab it from the cabinet, swallow it down, and completely move on with your day. But that one tiny white tablet, it contains something your ancestors would have literally killed for. The story of how humans actually survived sickness before that pill existed is darker, stranger, and honestly, way more remarkable than anything we were taught in school. Think about our modern reality for a second. Medicine is easy, but 50,000 years ago, getting a minor cut or an infection wasn't just some inconvenience, it was a sudden death sentence. There were no pharmacies, obviously, no emergency rooms a few miles down the road. You couldn't just Google your symptoms. It was just humans, a brutal, unforgiving natural world, and whatever creative ideas they could come up with to keep themselves alive. So how exactly did humanity survive for thousands of years without doctors, hospitals, or antibiotics? It's a mystery that really forces us to completely reframe how we view ancient people. I mean, they weren't just primitive cavemen standing around in the dirt wishing they had penicillin. They were incredibly observant, deeply practical scientists, and they relied on generations of memory, intense trial and error, and most importantly, community. Section 1. The First Medicine: Compassion and Community. Let's go back to 1960. Researchers were excavating a 60,000-year-old burial site in Shenadar Cave up in northern Iraq, and they found a Neanderthal man whose very existence basically defies logic. He lived to be about 40 or 50 years old, which, by the way, is remarkably old for Neanderthal, but his physical conditions were catastrophic. He had an amputated right arm, he was partially blind, he had severe arthritis in his spine and joints, he literally could not hunt or gather food. By every single measure of prehistoric survival, this guy should have died decades earlier. But he didn't. And the only reason he survived is because his tribe fed him. They protected him. They cared for him, day in and day out, for years. It proves that human empathy was our absolute first medical tool. Healthcare didn't start in sterile white rooms. It started around a fire 60,000 years ago, when someone refused to abandon a vulnerable member of their tribe. Section 2. Nature's Ancient Pharmacy: Discovering Medicine Through Trial and Error. Now, care and compassion are great, but they weren't our ancestors' only weapons. Long before anyone understood what a bacteria or a virus actually was, early humans were turning the entire natural world into a pharmacy, and they did it through thousands of years of deadly trial and error. Just look at this timeline. 60,000 years ago at Shenadar Cave, graves were packed with specific medicinal plant pollen. Jump forward to 5,300 years ago, and we have Otzi the Iceman, a mummy found frozen in the Alps who was literally carrying his own personal medical kit. Fast forward again to 3,500 years ago, and the ancient Egyptians are meticulously documenting the medical uses of willow bark. Our ancestors were basically running a massive, chaotic, global clinical trial. And here's the crazy part. This wasn't pseudoscience. This is legitimate pharmacology. Otzi was carrying birch polypore mushrooms. Modern science proves those exact mushrooms have antibiotic and antiparasitic properties, which is exactly what he needed for the intestinal parasites he had. Neanderthals consumed yarrow and groundsel, which are plants with zero nutritional value but massive anti-inflammatory effects. And that willow bark the Egyptians were chewing on, it contains salicin. In 1897, chemists synthesized that exact compound and named it aspirin. The pill in your cabinet right now is essentially the exact same molecule your ancestors figured out how to pull off a tree. Okay, so plants are absolutely incredible for pain and infection. But what happened when they suffered severe physical trauma that a chewed up leaf couldn't fix? You know, their horrific wounds from hunting accidents, wild animals, or war. Section 3. The Shocking World of Surgery: Operating with Stone Tools. This brings us to a much darker, visceral part of our history. We're talking about complex surgery performed thousands of years before anesthesia or modern sterilization even existed. Over 9,000 years ago, humans were performing a procedure called trepanation. That means they were using a literal stone tool to drill or scrape a hole directly into a living human skull. Archaeologists have found these skulls on every single inhabited continent. Ancient humans were trying to reverse engineer problems inside the head that they couldn't fully see, like relieving pressure from a fractured skull or treating severe seizures, by cutting right into the bone. Now I know what you're thinking. Doing brain surgery with a rock has to be a guaranteed death sentence, right? Well, based on the visible bone regrowth and healing around the edges of these ancient cuts, researchers estimate that 50 to 90% of these patients actually survived. 50 to 90%. Some of these skulls even show multiple healed holes. These weren't just botched, desperate guesses. These were highly practiced, successful surgical procedures being passed down through generations. And it wasn't just skull surgery either. There's a 7,000-year-old skeleton found in France that shows a cleanly healed forearm amputation. Think about that for a second. Surviving an amputation isn't just about the surgical cut itself. It means the tribe successfully managed that massive wound, kept out deadly infections, and fed a recovering patient for months. They had a fully functioning medical support system millennia before doctors even figured out they should wash their hands in the 1860s.
Section 4. Bizarre but effective. The science hidden in strangeness.
So how exactly did they keep those massive surgical wounds from getting infected in the dirt and grime of the ancient world? Well, they used treatments that sound completely unhinged today, but are actually fiercely backed by modern biological science. Ancient Egyptians packed their wounds with honey. Why? Because honey is genuinely antibacterial. It has a low pH and naturally releases hydrogen peroxide. In fact, modern hospitals use medical-grade honey today for that exact reason. How about indigenous cultures globally using maggots? Maggots only eat dead tissue, so they act like tiny, microscopic surgeons cleaning out infected wounds. Ancient Greeks and Celts packed bleeding wounds with spider webs. Sounds totally insane. Until you learn that spider silk contains vitamin K, which actively aids in blood clotting. They observed what worked, and they used it out of pure, brilliant necessity. Okay, so they could bandage a wound and they could amputate a shattered limb. But what about the invisible diseases? What did they do when microscopic pathogens started sweeping through a camp? Things they couldn't just cut out or pack with honey. Section 5. Mind, Ritual, and Immunity. The Psychology and Biology of Survival. This is where survival depended on an incredible, delicate dance between biology and psychology. That invisible war was fought by the human immune system. Now, ancient humans didn't live in sterilized environments like we do. Constant, unrelenting exposure to dirt and pathogens from birth built extraordinarily capable immune defenses. They ate incredibly diverse diets rich in wild, fermented foods, naturally loading their guts with probiotics and building spectacular microbiomes. And when they did get a bad fever, instead of panicking and suppressing it with ice, ethnographic studies show they actually moved the sick person closer to the fire. They intuitively knew what modern science only recently confirmed. A fever is just the immune system turning up the heat to kill off heat-sensitive pathogens. They just let it burn. But we absolutely cannot ignore the psychological side of healing. In almost every ancient culture, a shaman or a healer used elaborate rituals, chanting, fire, and a strong community presence to treat the sick. Now, they didn't know about germ theory, obviously, but they were tapping into deeply documented neuroscience, the placebo effect. When a whole tribe gathers around a sick person, the patient's brain receives a powerful, undeniable signal that they are safe and cared for. This ritual visibly lowers stress hormones like cortisol, it shifts immune activity, and it physically changes how the brain perceives pain. The mind's capacity to heal the body was literally activated by the community. Section 6. The Inheritance of Survival. We are the proof. Now, fairness demands we acknowledge a brutal reality here. Childhood mortality in the ancient world was staggering. Huge percentages of people died from infection before they even reached age 5. But the ones who survived that brutal gauntlet emerged incredibly resilient, often living deep into their 60s and 70s. Which brings us to this really powerful realization. We didn't invent medicine, we inherited it. Every single modern medical marvel traces its roots back to someone crouching in a cave, chewing on tree bark, fighting desperately to keep their community alive. They passed their successes down through stories, rituals, and memories. They created a chain of survival that stretches back tens of thousands of years. You, sitting here right now watching this explainer, you are the living proof that their chaotic, brave experiments actually worked. The human species simply refused to die. So I'll leave you with this to think about. The next time you open your medicine cabinet, look past the plastic bottles and the sterile white packaging. What ancient survival secret, discovered by firelight millennia ago, is currently hiding right there on your shelf?